Hello and welcome to the 27th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest-running annual literary festival, which hosts dozens of free and low-cost readings, craft classes, panel discussions, and many more exciting literary events. This year's headlining authors are Maggie Smith, Li-Young Lee, and Danez Smith. We're thrilled to be hosting in-person events featuring those headliners alongside over 60 talented writers from our region and beyond. The festival takes place this Thursday through Sunday, April 10th through the 13th, in many venues across downtown Spokane, Cheney, and even Coeur d'Alene. And we're excited to be presenting 8 virtual events here on YouTube this year. You can find our full schedule along with information about all of our festival authors by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to welcome Mackenzie Draper, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator, who will introduce today's event.
Welcome, everyone. We're excited to present authors Elizabeth Hilborn and Michelle Nijhouse for In Defense of Animals, Conservation as a Life's Work. We will hear about the importance of documenting the work and telling the stories of climate and environmental advocates in this volatile time on Earth. Elizabeth and Michelle are not just authors, but experts in the field of environmental science. They will kick off our event by reading a section from each of their works. Our first reader is Elizabeth Hilborn. Elizabeth is the author of Restoring Eden, Unearthing the Agribusiness Secret That Poisoned My Farming Community, a true story of lost wildlife and surprising discoveries. What she learned affects us all. She's an environmental health scientist, bee specialist veterinarian, and writer who focuses on sustainable agriculture and native pollinators. Her work has appeared in Modern Farmer, Civil East, and Outdoor America. Hilborn enjoys spending time outdoors on her family fruit farm in central North Carolina. Please welcome Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mackenzie. It's so great to be here at Get Lit. I'm really excited. So I'm going to read a couple of sections from Restoring Eden, and I'll start at the beginning. We live far out in the countryside, so we're never alone. At the end of a dirt road is our farm, set in a clearing in the green forest of central North Carolina. 2 people, hundreds of animals, thousands if I squint a bit or pull out the magnifying glass. There are billions more if I use a microscope. We live among multitudes. Travel with me down the road in mid-May. The sun is shining and it's climbed high enough to clear the trees. A checkered pattern of deep shadow and glaring light lays upon the packed gravel ahead. Watch. Box turtles cross while the day is cool. Gnats gather and swirl in select beams of sunlight, confusing the still air. Plant leaves push watery droplets out from within, offering sweet, mineral-rich refreshment to tiny mouths. Drops of dew glitter from plants along the way. Dew on leaves project the illusion of 1,000 stars, but really the drops contain 1,000 tiny worlds. If, as I learned to do, one lowers the threshold of perception to notice the shy things, the tiny things, the obvious things that seem to merit no special attention, one can perceive some of the individual threads that create the fabric of our living world. And my second section is just after halfway through the book. After our farm was stricken, I had to investigate to identify the culprit. And after weeks of intensive work, I took a break. Eager for an escape from troubles at the farm, early on a Saturday in mid-July, I drove to the mountains high above the Blue Ridge Parkway. My afternoon was spent hiking on the side of a mountain in a grassy meadow filled with wildflowers. The smell of sun-warmed herbs infused the air. An almost imperceptible breeze made flowers nod. Butterflies covered the pink milkweed and purple thistle flowers in full bloom, and I stopped to watch them. I closed my eyes and my body stilled. Strong rays warmed my back and my neck. Birdsong and the hum of working bees filled my ears. I imagined the planet spinning steadily upon its axis, with all life moving over, under, and through the earth, each creature doing its own special work, every organism contributing to the bright, shining mosaic of a living planet. When I opened my eyes, I saw the bees moving around me, disregarding, but yielding if I moved towards them. My presence among them was meaningless. They were engaged in an ancient dance, a dance refined over at least 100 million years of co-evolution with flowering plants. The dance involves details more intricate than the rites of ancient Eleusis, more precise than rituals among standing stones. The calculus is complex. On a fine day, with calm air, after a certain number of hours of chill over the past winter, when the sun is at the right angle, the day length is correct, and the soil warmed to the proper temperature, the dance of the bumblebee queens begins. During a few weeks in spring, the fate of a future colony fully depends upon the efforts and success of a single queen. She emerges from hibernation, ready to start a new family. She finds flower nectar and pollen to gather strength, and the queen does all the work until her first daughters emerge from their cradles. Then they become the food foragers and the babysitters. Bumblebee daughters work tirelessly to support those colonies. That short vacation reacquainted me with some of the multitude from which I gained strength. It gave me hope. For weeks afterward, back home at the farm, I used the memory of the warm, scented breeze and the bees' deep hum to remind myself of what normal can be. I was determined to experience normal at the farm once again. I just wasn't sure how I'd get there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Our second reader is Michelle Nyhouse. After 15 years off the grid in rural Colorado, she and her family now live in White Salmon, Washington. A lapsed biologist, she specializes in stories about conservation and global change. Her book, Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction, A Critical History of the Modern Conservation Movement, was named one of the best books of the year by the Chicago Tribune, Smithsonian, Book List, and other publications. She is a longtime contributing editor of High Country News, and her writing has appeared in many publications, including National Geographic, the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and the New York Review of Books. Her work has won several national honors, including 2 AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Awards and inclusion in 4 Best American Anthologies. Please welcome Michelle.
Thanks so much, Kate. It's great to be here at Get Lit, and it's great to be here with Elizabeth, whose book I really admire. I'll read 2 short sections from my book, one from the very beginning and one from a later chapter. In the spring of 1994, when I had half an undergraduate degree in biology and precious few practical skills, I was hired as a field assistant on a wildlife research project in the desert of the southwestern U.S. My job would have tickled Aesop. Every morning before dawn, I hiked alone over the sandstone to a designated spot. There, I waited until the ground warmed and the tortoise I'd been assigned to watch dragged herself out of her burrow, blinking with what looked like weary exasperation. I spent the next few hours hovering at a distance, sneaking sips of water as I took notes on when and what the tortoise ate. When the day grew hot and the tortoise finally retreated into the shade, I stumbled back across the burning sand, fighting the feeling that once again I had somehow lost the race. Desert tortoises were and are protected as a threatened species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and my weird, dreamy job was surrounded by bitter and sometimes violent arguments over their future. What struck me was how deep those arguments ran. While people fought over how to give sanctuary to tortoises, which construction projects or public land grazing leases to curtail, which off-road vehicle tracks to close, they were also fighting about why and even whether they should be expected to protect tortoises at all. In the Red Rock Canyons that once sheltered the ancestral Puebloans, in meeting rooms and courtrooms and small town coffee shops, people were arguing over nothing less than humanity's proper place on Earth. After I returned to college and finished my degree, I spent several more years as an itinerant biologist. I searched California streams for endangered frogs and counted wildlife charred plants in the Sonoran Desert, working with people who poked rattlesnakes for fun and called flowers by their Latin and Greek names. I learned about other species on my own, and later, as a journalist, I started to write about the relationships between them. For more than 20 years, I've followed the arguments over the future of other species, and most of them sound familiar. We're still fighting over whether and why to provide sanctuary, and still waiting too long to figure out how. This stuckness has a lot to do with money and politics, of course, but it also has a lot to do with history and with how we see and don't see that history today. After all, it wasn't so long ago that many people in North America and Europe thought they understood their relationships with other animals and with the groups of organisms called species. The Bible said that God granted humans dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and every living thing that moved upon the earth, and that more or less settled it, despite Aesop's rude reminders that the fish and fowl occasionally won. In the middle of the 19th century, these complacent humans learned that they were both less exceptional and more powerful than they had believed. From Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, they learned that their ties to other animals were far closer than previously thought. They also came to realize that their rapidly industrializing and globalizing societies could drive species into extinction, and in fact had already done so, first on remote ocean islands and then much closer to home. The most powerful and powerfully destructive civilizations on Earth are still absorbing this double shock. No matter our creed or culture, most of us would agree that the animals we domesticate for companionship, labor, and sustenance shouldn't be abused, though our definitions of abuse may vary widely. Less clear are our responsibilities toward animals hunted for food and sport. And even murkier are those toward animals who are annoying, dangerous, or allegedly useless. The understanding that humans are capable of exterminating entire groups of organisms raised a new question. Why should any of us make sacrifices, even in the short term, to ensure the persistence of other species on the planet? Until very recently, Western philosophers and religious scholars paid little attention to such questions, and many scientists shied away from them. Laws that try to answer them often raise more dilemmas than they settle. And Aesop, well, Aesop would probably laugh and wish us luck. And then a short section from the third chapter in my book. Each chapter focuses on a person or a group of people who stood at a turning point in the history of modern conservation. And this chapter is about a suffragist and later in life a conservationist named Rosalie Edge, who was one of my favorite people to get to know and to write about. On the morning of October 29th, 1929, at the southern tip of Manhattan Island, jittery bankers, stockbrokers, clerks, and messengers crowded into the Great Hall of the New York Stock Exchange. Millions of citizens had invested in the soaring stock market in recent years, many draining their savings to buy shares. In early September, stock prices had fallen sharply, recovered, then dropped and kept dropping. For days, clerks had been working through the night to handle the demands of panicked sellers. By the time the opening gong sounded on that Tuesday morning, the stock exchange's medical department was prescribing sedatives to anxious traders. 5 miles north in her brownstone on East 72nd Street, Mrs. Charles Noel Edge put on an elegant dress and walked to nearby Central Park. It was a cloudy, unseasonably cold morning, but as soon as she stepped into the park, she lifted her binoculars and began to look for birds. She wandered west along the paths and through the patches of woods, noting a robin, a starling, a grackle, a junco, and several species of sparrows. Though she arrived late to her destination, the American Museum of Natural History, she was, as she later remembered, happy and relaxed as one is after enjoying the companionship of birds. When she entered the small ground floor room where the National Association of Audubon Societies was conducting its 25th annual meeting, the assembly stirred with curiosity. Edge had been a life member of the association for years, but annual meetings tended to be familial gatherings of directors and employees, and those present were clearly surprised by the appearance of an ordinary member, life or otherwise. As she was shown to a front row seat, she noticed a hermit thrush perched on the window ledge outside. Edge listened as Theodore Palmer, a zoologist and member of the board of directors, finished a speech extolling the association. She would recall the scene with regal irony. It was my first experience hearing the Audubon Society praise itself, and it impressed me to know how great and good it was. Palmer's pride, however, was surely genuine. The National Association, which represented more than 100 local societies, was the leading conservation organization in North America, if not the world, during a time of intense public interest in wildlife in general and birds in particular. The directors of the association were widely respected scientists and successful businessmen, some of whom must have had riches at stake downtown. As Palmer concluded his remarks, he mentioned that the association had dignifiedly stepped aside from responding to A Crisis in Conservation, a recently published pamphlet that accused the National Association of Audubon Societies of serving sportsmen better than birds. Edge raised her hand and stood to speak, for A Crisis in Conservation was her reason for attending. What answer can a loyal member of the society make to this pamphlet? She asked. What are the answers? Edge at the time was almost 52 years old, slightly taller than average, with a stoop that she would later blame on hours of letter writing. She favored black satin dresses and fashionably complicated, though never feathered, hats. She wore her graying hair in a simple knot at the back of her head. She was invariably well spoken, with a plummy, cultivated accent and a habit of drawing out phrases for emphasis. She could be deceptively diffident when it served her purposes, but her sharp, strikingly pale blue eyes were constantly taking in her surroundings, and her characteristic attitude was one of imperious vigilance. As a New Yorker writer once put it, somewhere between that of Queen Mary and a suspicious pointer. Edge's questions to the Audubon directors were polite but piercing. Was the association tacitly supporting bounties on bald eagles in Alaska, as the pamphlet stated? Had it endorsed a bill that would have allowed wildlife refuges to be turned into public shooting grounds? Her inquiries, as she recalled years later, were met with leaden silence, and then, suddenly, outrage. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Now that we've heard a bit of each of your work, let's turn things back over to you two for a conversation about conservation and its advocates.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Elizabeth, it's so great to hear you read your words.
And you.
So your experience was, I don't know if many people can point to a specific moment when they became aware of the conservation issue that they wanted to pursue, but yours was stark, and it remains, I think, very vivid in your mind. Can you tell us about the moment when you came to the swale on your farm and what you noticed?
Sure. I don't know if I appreciated the implications. We have a fruit farm in North Carolina, and I was out working and stopped by a local wetland to watch tadpoles, of course, as everyone does.
Who doesn't?
And I noticed the water was dead with a thin gray scum all over the surface. And so I realized that the wetland was sick. There were dead insects lying around. But what I didn't appreciate at that time, I knew the wetland was the center of the community. It was always full of life, birds and the tadpoles and frogs and dragonflies. It was just beautiful, which is why I'd stop by. But everything drinks water. And wildlife really, really appreciates still water where there aren't predators that are rising up to grab them. Or so So wetlands are so important. And as the damage spread and more of the wildlife disappeared or died, I realized how fragile the environment is and how what I considered to be like a local event, it was severe, but it was very local. The effect wasn't local at all. The fact that it was water made it much more global. And so when we weren't able to grow fruit, that really brought it home because we'd lost all our pollinators, our flying insects. And I'd kind of always, this sounds bad, I'd, I'd always kind of, I knew I needed pollinators, but I took them for granted.
Of
I'd
course.
plant a tree, the tree would bloom. When it was mature, I'd get fruit. And it's just the way things worked. It always happened, like the sun rising. And when it didn't happen, when the tree bloomed, but there was no fruit, I had the, oh my goodness moment that it wasn't me growing this fruit all along. I was part of a community that produced that food. And when all my community helpers were gone, I couldn't do it alone.
Yeah, you write about that so powerfully, and I think it's such a good reminder to your readers, to me, that you can have a background in science, you can grow up loving being passionate about animals as you did, and you worked as a veterinarian, you work as an environmental scientist. Ecology was nothing new to you. You understood these connections, but at the same time, it's so easy for any of us to take them for granted. And until you're looking at your fruit trees and saying, oh, suddenly I realize why this tree is not producing, and why this farm that I've stewarded for many years is not what it once was. Um, there's a level of understanding that we don't reach, I think, until that happens.
That's right. It was a really visceral experience. Human experience is God, right? I could read about something all day long. And your discussion of these early, can I call them conservationists? People who
Yeah.
appreciated the natural world for what it was and felt and understood those connections. It's really interesting to see some of the really basic questions that they were unraveling, because you mentioned the directives of scripture to be dominion, to have dominion over creation. So can you talk more about some of these really early struggles beyond just hunting wildlife and not putting any restrictions on it, such as an Audubon Society meeting?
Yeah. Well, I should say I want to differentiate the beginning of the modern, what I think of as the modern conservation movement, from the kinds of conservation people have practiced since the beginning of human history. Of course, indigenous communities have practiced their own kinds of conservation, and many have their own understanding of ecological relationships that I think our cultures are just now coming to appreciate the importance of. But when we look back at the international or the modern conservation movement, it really started with people realizing that it was possible to drive other species globally extinct, not just extinct through overhunting in one's backyard. And so the struggle was, as you say, first to prevent really direct threats like overhunting. Um, and in fact, some early conservationists had to be pushed by people like Rosalie Edge to not just pick out species that they particularly liked for protection. They had to be pushed to protect all species from these kinds of direct threats. Like bald eagles were thought of as kind of a pest, something that competed with human hunters. And so the Audubon Society, in the excerpt I read, were kind of turning a blind eye or not fighting very hard against a bounty that the state of Alaska had placed on bald eagles. And it took
Wow.
people like Rosalie Edge, who had kind of a prescient understanding of ecology. Like the science, the formal science was very young at the time. There really weren't words like food web or things that or ecosystem, things that we take for granted now and learn about in middle school. Those words were not available to the general public. And so it took people like her to say, you know what, I think maybe all species might be important in ways that we don't quite understand and, can't explain it scientifically, but I think they're all important. And so, it's relatively recently that Western science has spelled out those relationships and really, documented them with the scientific method and said, oh yeah, these things that people have observed and talked about and told stories about for millennia, that those are the relationships that maintain our lives as we know them. And I mean, I think one of the early challenges of that people like Rosalie Edge faced was that, unlike your situation where the change was quite stark, many of these changes in relationships among species take place very slowly over time. And so it might take, you couldn't just go out in your backyard and say, oh my God, things have changed since last Wednesday. Things have changed quite a bit and there's a problem here. It took years, sometimes generations of documentation to really show that something was going wrong and that there was a more subtle, something else was threatening species other than these direct threats like overhunting. There was something invisible in the air, as there was in your situation, that was happening. And it was causing damage that was hard to see, but was equally as devastating.
Thank you. And I think about how that knowledge is shared. You mentioned the indigenous culture and just being aware of wildlife because people directly depended upon wildlife. There wasn't a lot, as I understand it, I may be wrong, as I understand it, there wasn't a lot of cultivation of livestock for food. There was certainly farming of plants, but the wildlife itself, there were stories that were told from parent to child. It was an important part of society to know how to coexist successfully with wildlife and still be fed.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think about colonists coming over from Europe and already having lost that connection, that immediate connection with these animals around me are so valuable for my life, to continue my life. And part of it was, I think, livestock culture helped separate that. We could keep animals and focus on their well-being. And it actually displaced wildlife. As you mentioned, wildlife could become a pest because when we're concentrating a lot of food in one area, it attracts animals who want to eat that food. So it seems that the culture we imported to this continent really did us a disservice if we want to preserve the animals that were here.
Well, definitely. It just, I mean, the culture that arrived in North America was just by the nature of the circumstances of its arrival was divorced from the ecosystem and saw the ecosystem in a different way. I think when I have spoken with Indigenous conservationists who are working to revive or reestablish their traditions, often they will say, look, my culture is not perfect. There's nothing special or elevated about our knowledge of conservation. We've just been at it for a very long time.
Yeah.
And they've been at it for a very long time in a particular place. So that knowledge goes very deep. And the knowledge of the community's dependence on the ecosystem goes very deep. It is, visceral, generationally visceral, as we might say, as we were just talking about, rather than coming from a culture that came to an ecosystem and immediately saw its products as commodities, as Europeans coming to North America saw the bison. They were very quickly became part of the international market and were seen as nothing more than really, carriers of very lucrative hides, and that was really the drive of demand from Europe and the East Coast, urban North America for hides was the reason why the bison declined so precipitously and almost went extinct.
Yeah.
At the end of the 1800s, early 1900s.
Oh, that comment, a carrier of hides. That's so chilling. I mean, that's what happened with the beaver as well
Right.
in
Right.
many areas, and minks and otters, the carrier of hides. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the same thing happened to the beaver. And now, of course, we all know how important the beaver is to many of our ecosystems. So,
Yeah.
Elizabeth, one thing we have talked about and I wanted to ask you about was how, you came to this as a scientist, as a farmer and a longtime resident of your place, but also as a scientist, and you turned to data to document what was happening in your wetland, but you found you needed more than that, to start repairing uh, what had been lost. So can you tell me about all the tools you used, so to speak?
Sure. And I'll just, before I started talking about my experience, I want to acknowledge how unusual it is to have data about wildlife populations, conditions of water, or in my world, I kept a journal of my fruit production, when things would bloom, when they would bear. I kept a journal of rainfall every day. When the river nearby our home flooded, we're high above it, but there's a large floodplain. And I would keep notation of that. But what I didn't have were years of data on the animals. And it was all my casual observations of living there. I was not doing any sort of systematic inquiry. I would say, oh yeah, there are bees on the flowers, that kind of thing. I wouldn't look at to see what kinds of bees or the flower flies or what was pollinating what. I would just notice it was happening and say, yes, that's great. We're going to have a good crop this year. So I think, and I remember reaching out early on and frantically trying to understand what I was seeing and put it in context, but I had no context to put it into. I didn't have years of bee population data. And as soon as I started talking to bee scientists and ecologists, they were like, okay, that's your observation. What does it mean? Without context, I can't say.
Right.
So that is something I really notice now when people do studies of places over many years, some are even decades. That is so valuable because we're in a place now where those kind of systematic observations, going back to the same sampling site year after year and doing comprehensive systematic surveys, it shows that we are in insect and bird decline. And I'm not sure we'd know that without that kind of work because it is so gradual. Our baseline changes. I remember driving home from work about 15 years ago, and I mentioned to my husband, I'm really scared. I'm not seeing birds in the air anymore. And he was like, huh, that's weird. Like it wasn't part of his world. But I remember just 15 years before that, doing the same drive and commonly seeing birds flying over the road between forests and again, just a single observation. It's not enough, and some people may not. I'm such an animal nerd. I really notice them when I'm looking, but I just didn't have the context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many stories in the history of conservation that touch on that. It's one that I think about all the time is how Rosalie Edge, who I read about, started the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, and again with her, she was just a very smart woman. She didn't have any particular instruction in ecology, but she thought, well, she hung out with a lot of biologists from the American Museum of Natural History, and she was just very attuned to the natural world. And she thought, well, it seems like it'd be a good idea for someone to take note of the hawks that are flying over here every year. And so the sanctuary manager started doing that in the 1930s after the sanctuary
Wow.
was founded, and he did it every spring and every fall. And I think he took a couple of years off because he was shipped overseas during World War II. But other than that, it was a continuous record. And then in the 1960s, he got a letter from someone I'm sure everyone has heard of, Rachel Carson, who said, hey, I've heard that something is happening with the eagle population around Hawk Mountain. Can you tell me what you're seeing? And he wrote back, and you can see these letters, they're still in existence. And he said, well, yeah, there's been an enormous decline in the juveniles. We are not seeing the number of young eagles has been dropping to the point where we hardly see any anymore. And he was able to look back at the numbers he had collected over, those 30 or so years and say, this is not just a blip. This is not just, there was a storm that day
Yeah.
and so we didn't, or there was a really bad weather that season and so we didn't see many. He was able to say this is definitely a change over time and something significant is happening. And that became a really important piece of evidence in Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. And really, Rachel Carson, when she published Silent Spring, she didn't have a sort of smoking gun, so to speak. She had to make her case like a lawyer, where she just accumulated evidence of, isn't this strange that all of these declines are happening at once? And that one was especially dramatic. And then after the book was published, we found out what DDT does to young birds' eggshells, and that was why, that was why there was this abrupt decline in juvenile numbers. But we wouldn't have known that had not Rosalie Edge come up with this like sort of crazy idea to keep to crazy task for the manager she had hired to look after the sanctuary. And had that manager not pursued it diligently, and had he not, paid attention to Rachel Carson's inquiry when it came in, we would not know that. And history would have been quite different.
Yeah. We owe a big debt to her. Might have.
And so, yeah, all those folks who pay attention, I think we don't. It's quiet work. We were talking. We have talked, and we just were talking about the importance of monitoring, as scientists often call it, and professional scientists often complain how underfunded it is because it takes
Yeah.
so long to get dramatic results, and it is kind of unsexy or just out. I mean, it's amazing to be out in these wonderful places, but what you bring home is just a line of numbers. You don't bring home, some kind of revelation, at least not immediately, at least not until your data accumulates. So it can be difficult to fund, but it is so important, especially as the world is changing faster than ever before.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So how did your tell us a little bit more about how your search for answers proceeded, because you were you had to be really resourceful. It wasn't as simple as just calling up a local agency and saying, hey, something strange is happening at my farm.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a bulldog, especially when I'm dealing with animal deaths. Like I was a
Mm.
veterinarian and I couldn't save these animals that were dying around me. So I was highly motivated. So I was talking to so many people, and it's really interesting that my particular situation, I was reaching out to water specialists, environmental specialists, agricultural specialists. So there's a farmer nearby. And I would tell them what I was seeing. And I kept hearing, oh, I've never heard of such a thing. And then I was connected with a wildlife biologist, a herpetologist,
Mm.
Stephen. And I told him my story. And he said, oh, yeah, that happens all the time. I said, what? I think I sat down in my chair because it was such a direct opposite. And I said, what does it? He said, oh, crop fields, the water near crop fields is always damaged. And I said, what does that? Because I'd gathered water samples and I had to figure out what to request for the
Mhm.
analysis. So I need chemical names. He said, I don't know. I just see it all the time. So what really helped me, I think, was this isn't an area of my scientific expertise, but I do know how to um, research or search for scientific papers. And I found years and years of people who'd been studying this and sounding the alarm about water contamination. So I think that was my biggest superpower, was that I could make my way through the literature, and I just didn't give up. I,
Mhm.
I just kept searching. But I know that one of the things that really brought home to me was obviously the bees and insect pollinators were a big part of my area of interest because it affected the fruit farm, but it was the whole community. There were animals that were missing from the floodplain meadows, and the soil was just flabby and dense, like
Mm.
old pancake batter. Whereas up away from the damage, it was friable and full of life and drained well. And I was like, whoa, it was like it affected everything. And I think um, when I was reading the scientific papers, there was always an animal of interest or a smaller focus. And yet the actual effects of the event were so broad, it really disrupted the ecosystem. There were knock-on effects that I couldn't have anticipated. Um, our birds have been slow to recover, and I noticed the pollinators, the big ones, came back first, like the big eastern carpenter bees came back first. And if it wasn't for them, we would have had no fruit for probably 2 or 3 more years. They really saved us with pollination services. But it was the tiny little pollinators, the fruit flies, that would pollinate the wild viburnums, which made berries for the birds.
Mm.
And our birds were really slow to return because the food source wasn't there.
Mhm.
So not only was it so full of surprises, but it was an uneven recovery. It wasn't just like, okay, this year is a little better than last year, and it wasn't linear at all.
Yeah,
It's complex out there.
it is. And more, when the closer we look, the more complex we realize it is, right? I
Yeah.
I don't want to give away the ending of your book, or the answer to the mystery, because it really is a mystery that you have to solve almost as a detective. I hope people who are listening will buy the book and read and enjoy that journey. But how is your farm doing now?
We're recovering, but it's
Yeah,
not the way it used to be. It was
yeah,
interesting. I had just started a specialty as a bee veterinarian, and
yeah.
The
I
month
wanted to ask you about that work.
The month before the farm was contaminated, I was out in the orchard taking photographs of pollinators because I was trying to learn about all the native pollinators we have. So I have this amazing photographic record of the place just before it changed. So
Mm,
I can kind of look back, but that was just a few days, you know. We were talking about the years of monitoring that really make a difference.
yeah. So
One,
what does a bee veterinarian do?
oh, well, I'd say my primary job, because beekeepers and the whole state beekeeping establishment's been in place for so long, and veterinarians are new to the world. And we're really only needed because the Food and Drug Administration changed rules in 2017 so that antibiotics are more tightly controlled. So beekeepers now need a veterinarian to prescribe antibiotics to use on their bees when needed. There are some brood diseases. The baby bees get bacterial diseases, and there's one in particular that can be treated with antibiotics.
Mhm.
So I step in to support beekeepers, basically.
I see. To make
Yeah.
sure that to make sure that the cure is needed and is not worse than the disease. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, since Silent Spring, there's been increasing awareness of environmental needs and the needs to protect animals and ecosystems. And there's always been, as you mentioned, this tension between economic interests and the interests of preserving natural areas. And there was I watched as this became more prevalent in the 90s and 2000s, the whole concept of ecosystem services. If we can
Mhm.
put a dollar figure on a wetland and show that wetland produces so many thousands of dollars per year filtering water, etc., then it can be put in the calculus of what if we plow it under and put crops there. Like how we can put a dollar figure on what we're losing so that we can make rational economic choices. Um, but I, I would love to hear your thoughts on the idea of just taking a feature like pollinators and just a generic pollinator, say the honeybee, and how the bee provides pollination services, but there's no nuance there. And about how that whole paradigm has really fallen short as a means to protect the natural world.
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue. And I mean, I think that the the ecosystem services field, which did develop in the 90s and is still ongoing, was onto something important because without any kind of valuation, be it numerical or otherwise, the natural world ends up being valued at zero in
Right.
any kind of analysis. So I think it is helpful to have, when possible, it is helpful to have some numbers, but they can't stand alone. I think that the great vulnerability is, if you say, oh, well, this wetland, provides $20 million a year in water for purification services. Well, if if a water filtration plant is built that does the same job, then the value, the supposed value of that wetland drops. Is well, we know that's nice, but we no longer need that wetland. This filtration plant does the job much faster, and look, we've already paid it off. So it's it's vulnerable to replacement, and of course, as you say, it's so incomplete. It doesn't
Yep.
not only can the number itself be really so rough as to be inaccurate, because we just don't know enough about these relationships, but it just doesn't capture the human relationship with other species and all of the subtleties of it. So I I think it is valuable, but I just think it has to be taken in context. And we, in American society are so quick to put a price tag on things. We love to sort of boil things down to a number and simplify them according to their cash value. That I think we do have to be really careful with grabbing for the ecosystem services concept as a as a cure all. And I think as the field has matured, people have come to realize that that it has to be one tool among many, and that it can't be. There was at certain points in the growth of the field of conservation biology, there have been pushes to, oh well, we need to place much more emphasis on ecosystem services because we need to show why our field is valuable to humans. And I
Right.
think there's been a realization of, well, yes, but but we need the field to be much broader than that, and we need it to be about more than humans. We need to be showing benefits to all species, and we need to show them in not just in numbers, but in all kinds of intangible ways.
It strikes me that we just don't know enough to do the valuation of what other species mean to us.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep coming back to food because I'm such a foodie. I love growing food. I love cooking, just everything about food. Because as I work with food, it feels like a bridge to a natural world, to the natural world. So even when I'm in my kitchen, I'm shaking the soil off a head of leaf lettuce, or it's just so I don't feel how I can be separated from the natural world when it feeds me. The natural world feeds me, and this experience made me feel the complex interaction among species. For example, the moths and butterflies that drank water from the damaged wetland um, may have become contaminated because our population of caterpillars dropped. Well, who cares about caterpillars? They eat leaves on the trees. Well, it turns out caterpillars are the only food of nestling birds. They can't digest seeds. The parents collect soft-bodied insects, and caterpillars are the caviar of soft-bodied insects. So without the caterpillars, the nestlings don't make it. And then the birds leave because their whole purpose is to reproduce and live and raise their babies. And when they leave for a more suitable place, then we lose all of the services of the birds that help control pests.
Mm-hmm.
And we lose when some insects are killed. Insecticides are not specific to one kind of insect. They can kill beneficial insects as well as pest insects. It's not a precise instrument or tool. And most insects are beneficial. So when the insects disappeared, we lost our helpers. We lost
Mm-hmm.
the pest predators that helped protect our crops. So we had terrible imbalances that I got to see that. So the wetland, which was conditioning water that flowed down from the uplands before it reached the river, was also supporting all these other spokes of this amazing wheel of life.
Hmm.
And when the spokes were gone, it didn't work.
Yeah. 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 Living on a farm, it gives you a very different perspective on food than it does when you're just buying a head of lettuce in the store, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
We're getting to the end of our time, and I wanted to ask you, since we're talking to an audience of readers and writers, how did you come to write Restoring Eden? Um, had you written before outside of the scientific field, or what tell me about that journey from experience to book?
Yeah, so I've been a reader my whole life, and I was drawn to books about the natural world, nonfiction as well as fiction. I grew up with that book, The Secret Garden.
Oh gosh,
It's a
one of my
favorite.
favorites. Yeah.
Hodgson. Yeah,
Don't we all want a secret garden?
absolutely. And I first started trying to write the book as a dry, objective, scientific. I had it all organized into category chapters, and I have a nephew who's a communicator. He's trained as a communicator, and I asked him if he'd review my early work, and I sent him a chapter, and I didn't hear anything at all. And then I bumped him. I was like, "Hey, what do you think?" And finally, he replied, "Why don't you just tell your story?"
Oh, interesting.
And that was terrifying, Michelle, because I had no idea how to tell a story. I can write an introduction, methods, results, discussion all day long, a typical framework of a scientific paper, but a story. So I really had to study. I took classes, I read craft books, including yours. Thank you so
Mhm.
much. And just really dove into writing and narrative. But I will tell you that I don't think I would have been able to write this book if I hadn't changed. As I was going deep to recall scenes and trying to pull back, okay, what did they say, so I could capture the dialogue and get it on paper quickly, I realized I started mindfulness
Mm.
techniques. And I feel that when I accessed my subconscious and creativity, it changed my wiring. Like I am a
Ah,
different person after writing
wow.
this book. So the land is healing on its own, slowly but surely, and I'm healing, telling a story.
Wow. I love that. I hadn't, we hadn't talked about that before. And I'll say that when I first read your book, I remember reading it and I kept looking at your bio and I was like, she's a scientist? Because this is a really well written book. And just like
Oh, thank
just
you.
your care with language is really, there's a lot of books out there that are perfectly clear and even very enjoyable to read, but your care with language was so obvious. And it really allowed your personal connection to the story and how important it was to you to shine through. But I blessings to that nephew who said, just tell your story, because that's like the simplest thing, right? But it's so difficult,
Yeah,
especially when you've been trained that that is somehow the wrong thing to do. I think
right.
we grow up as natural storytellers, of course. Here's what happened
Yeah.
at school today, or here's the funny thing my brother did. But it gets, in certain professions we're told that's not okay, and so to find a way to have to deliberately reconnect with it and to successfully do it, I think is really cool.
Like
And it's
you're
great you're
very
able to do it.
kind.
Yeah.
You're very kind, but I appreciate your skill of being able to tell a story in a chapter. That's amazing because it took me forever. A book length story. Like I could make my way through that, but I still have a lot to learn. So I appreciate our relationship and our conversation today. I learned so much from you, Michelle.
Well, likewise, and we come to it from different directions with different challenges, because when I came to writing my book from years of writing for magazines, and so what that does is it you retain your ability to tell a story, but you learn to tell it in no more than 3,000 to 5,000 words. And so
Yep,
I had to do
perfect.
my version of kind of reclaiming my creativity, or reclaiming my, ownership of the story I wanted to tell, to expand it into the space I had. So that was also very satisfying to kind of feel like, oh, I'm always, telling myself that's too much. I can't put that in, but now I can.
Mhm.
It
And you fleshed out the worlds, like
right.
dropping into a moment in time, the politics, the economics, the milieu of the
Yeah.
situation, and how we keep revisiting this situation over and over, but it always feels maybe a little different because of where we're sitting in time
Hmm.
and culture.
Yep. Very true. We each have our own version of these stories.
Yeah.
Um, well, it's been such a pleasure, Elizabeth. I look forward to talking more on and off
Yes.
camera. And
Yes.
thanks to everyone who's tuned in. I hope you enjoy the Get Lit Festival, both virtual and in-person versions. And we hope to see you soon.
Yes. What a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was so fantastic. I learned so much from that conversation. You both have just such unique and important perspectives to share, and you're doing such great work to give us that important context that you mentioned that we may be missing if we want to get a truer and deeper understanding of the complex ecological crises that we're all currently facing. So thank you again for that. And thank you for reminding us how important it is not to take our community helpers for granted, including pollinators. So again, we're just so grateful for your voices here in this space and for your books. Thank you again. And thank you also to Mackenzie, GetLit's assistant coordinator, for all of their hard work today and behind the scenes leading up to this event. To everyone watching at home, I hope that you will join us for more festival events, both in person and here on Zoom. Please visit our website, getlitfestival.org, for our full schedule and more information about all of our authors, including today's two talented writers. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.